Welcome students to support tutorial number 6, where we take a look at the theory of demand. This learning unit will focus on learning unit 6, or this support tutorial, I should rather say, will focus on learning unit 6. We'll take a look at cardinal and ordinal utility, get to understand what is utility and what is the difference between these two. We'll introduce you to marginal utility and total utility and teach you how to use them for calculations, as you can see in the next outcome there. And then we'll investigate ordinal utility in detail and get to grips with indifference curves and budget lines. Your concepts, as I've mentioned already, all new concepts to you that you're going to need to learn and understand. Unless you've studied economics before, chances are you haven't come across these at all. So please do take a lot of time or pay careful attention to what is the description or definition of each of these concepts. We obviously will be working with some of them now as we work through this tutorial. Here's your utility. We all need to understand utility in the same way. It is the degree of satisfaction that a household or a consumer derives or expects to derive from the consumption of a good or service. So what we're doing now is we're taking a look at how do we interpret utility in the context of economics. Please take note, ladies and gents, degree of satisfaction. We've got two major ways or two main ways of measuring or analyzing our utility in economics. The one is cardinal, which gives an actual number to the amount of utility that we get. And the second one is ordinal. Let's take a look at each of them in detail. Looking first at cardinal. This one says the idea that utility can be measured in some way. Example, measured in utils. So I could say a cup of tea gives me 40 utils. That number is completely subjective. In other words, I would give a cup of tea 40, you might give it 3. It depends on each of us individually. It also is an arbitrary number. In other words, today you ask me, I say 20 utils, but tomorrow you ask me and a cup of tea only gives me 15. Or maybe it gives me 35. It all depends on how much I would enjoy or what level of satisfaction that would give me at a specific point in time. All right. So we can use numbers, and those numbers are useful when we go in to illustrate some additional concepts. We'll be having a look at that in a moment. In the case of ordinal utility, perhaps a little bit more realistic in that we are ranking our preferences. So if I gave you a choice between 3 drinks, hot chocolate, tea, coffee, how would you rank those? Now, consumers are fairly consistent in the way they rank different preferences, and all our goods and services that we consume can be ranked. Starting with MU and EU, marginal utility is the addition to total utility when one more unit is consumed. So for example, talking about pizzas perhaps, because there's a picture there in front of us, how much satisfaction does each additional pizza or even each additional slice of pizza give me as I consume them consecutively? So I go 1 and I go 2 and I go 3. What is the additional level of satisfaction I get from each additional piece, slice, or entire pizza? The total utility is the cumulative satisfaction. In other words, the sum of all my marginal utilities. We're going to look at these in more detail shortly. What these two help us understand is a really important law. This is the law of diminishing marginal utility. It states that the marginal utility of a good or a service eventually declines as more of it is consumed during any given period. Now, interestingly enough, students, this is a concept that you're all aware of. You've just never given it a name. Let's look at it in more detail, or let's investigate this law. We start off with an example which is used in the textbook, which is looking at consuming apples. If I sat you down now and I said, you're going to eat 4 apples all in a row, what is likely to happen? Let's see. So there's your number of apples consumed, 1, 2, 3, 4. The marginal utility of apple number 1 might be quite high if you enjoy and like apples. So we say 50. The second apple Not quite as much as the first one, the third one even less, and the fourth one even less. And so the marginal utility would continue to decline if I asked you to eat more and more apples consecutively. Marginal utility can be used to work out your total utility. Remember, your total utility is the sum of marginal utilities. So the total utility of number 1 will usually be the same as the marginal utility. Let's go in and answer the questions and see if we can see the patterns that arise here. So what is the additional utility derived from the third apple consumed? Well, let's go to the third apple. Additional is marginal, so there we can see 29 utils. What is the total satisfaction derived by this consumer when she eats 2 apples? Well, let's go and have a look. Total utility, 2 apples, tells us 85, which is the sum of the first apple plus the second apple. Marginal utility 50 plus marginal utility 35 gives me 85. What do you notice about the marginal utility of each additional apple consumed? Well, if we look here, 50, 35, 29, 18, what do we see? That marginal utility is definitely decreasing. And that is that is our diminishing marginal utility. All right, moving on. Another way we can ask you questions on these concepts. Jackie is really hungry and decides she needs 3 hamburgers for lunch. She buys herself 3 hamburgers and discovers. First hamburger, she gets 30 utils. Second, 20 utils. Third, 5 utils. What is the total utility Jackie gets from eating all 3 hamburgers? Simply the sum of these, because these are the marginal utilities. So 30 plus 20, 50 plus 5 is 55. And then what is the marginal utility Jackie obtains from the second hamburger? It is simply 20 utils. This information that was given to us was the marginal utility. Students, you could get a table like this, which requires you now to go and calculate the marginal utilities of each additional movie that is watched by this consumer. I'd ask you at this point to pause, to go in, see if you can calculate your marginal utility, and then come and take a look and see, did I get it right or not? So pause, I'm moving on to the solution now. Here we go. There's the solution. How did we get our marginal utility each time? It is simply the difference between our total utilities, the change in total utility for each unit consumed, for each additional unit consumed. So 85 minus 50 gives us 35. 114 minus 85 gives us 29. 132 minus 114 gives us 18. And so all the way down until we have had enough of watching movies and our marginal utility goes to 0. And then if you make me watch one more movie, I go into negative utility, called disutility. And now my total utility will start to decrease. Also, students, we need at this point to derive a formula for marginal utility. So here is your formula. Delta TU, the change in total utility, divided by delta Q, which is the change in quantity. In this case, the change in quantity is only 1. So if we go from 1 movie to 2 movies, that is a change of 1. And then from 2 to 3, again, a change of 1. You have to just pay attention to those changes because they will impact on your calculations. Let's take a look at one more table, which is still fairly simple, and then move on to something that's a little bit more complex. All right, table like this. Now what you have to do is go between MU and TU. You want to find out in some cases what is the total utility, in other cases what is the marginal utility. Again, I'm going to say to you at this point, pause so that you can give this a try before you go on to the solution. I am now moving on to the solution. There you have it, fairly straightforward. Your first unit, usually they are the same. If we go on to our third, what was the marginal utility of our third cup of coffee? That would be the difference between 93 and 73, which is 20, divided by the difference between 3 and 2, which is 1. So 20 divided by 1 gives me 20. Then we go and have a look at the total utility for 4 cups of coffee. That will be the sum of your marginal utilities. So 42 plus 31 plus 20 plus 8. Or you can take a shortcut and simply say 93 plus 8 gives me 101. The next one you can see stays the same because I've reached my satiation point. I have had enough at this point, and then that next cup of coffee is going to go negative. And my total utility will start to decrease. Hope you're getting this, ladies and gents. One more chance to have a practice. This time, watch out for your change in quantity. You can see your number of cups of coffee have now changed 1 to 2 and then 2 to 5. That will affect your calculations. Take a careful look, pause at this point, try and see if you can work it out, and then take a look at the solution and see if you got it correct. All right, I'm moving on to the solution. There we have it. You can see we've had to divide by 3 because the change in Q here was 3. 5 minus 2 is 3. And then when you wanted to calculate your total utility, you had to take into account that the 6th one is missing here. We can't just ignore it. So the difference between 7 and 5 is 2. Therefore, I'm going to say 144 plus 12 times 2 is going to give me 168. Remember, if you don't get it, make sure you ask questions in your class. Cheers, folks, until the next one.